Welcome everyone to the second event of the Technologies of Power seminar. We're really looking forward to an engaging conversation today. My name is Madiha Tahir. I'm a Mellon postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands at ASU.
And my name is Adrien Zakar. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. Madiha and I are the moderators for today's event hosted by Columbia University, where we both received our PhDs. This event is part of a seminar series, Technologies of Power, where we host 3 speakers every other Friday throughout the fall.
So today's event considers the geopolitics of empire. And we ask with our speakers today, how does empire operate today? What kinds of technologies and actors do we need to consider as we grapple with imperial power? Who becomes visible and through what medium? And finally, what forms of resistance are possible?
You can find the full biographies of our speakers posted in the chat, but I will briefly introduce them now. Our first speaker is Samar Al-Bulushi. Samar is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. Her ethnographic research focuses on ongoing wars in Kenya against the Somali militant group Al-Shabaab. Our second speaker is John Muthiala. John teaches in the English department at the University of Southern Maine, where he leads the Digital Humanities Initiative. He has published on global surveillance and drone warfare. Our third speaker is Daryl Lee. Daryl is an assistant professor of anthropology and associate member of the law school at the University of Chicago. He's the author of The Universal Enemy, Jihad, Empire, and the Challenge of Solidarity. And he's an attorney licensed in Illinois and the state of New York. Thank you for joining us.
So today we're going to be experimenting with how best to run an online forum as we're going to do this throughout the fall. So let me explain how we're going to run today's event. Each of the speakers have pre-recorded a brief presentation, and we will run these presentations. After each presentation, we'll open the floor for about 10 to 15 minutes for audience questions and a moderated discussion, which will be moderated by Adrien and I. We encourage the panelists to engage with each other's presentations, and we also encourage the audience to ask questions and feel free to sort of have a conversation in the chat and post your questions there.
So please join us in welcoming Samar, John, and Daryl. And our first presentation is by Samar Al-Bulushi.
In early June of 2021, the Kenyan military bombed a number of villages in southern Somalia. One of those bombs killed Sarah Aden and her youngest child. Sarah's husband Ali was out of the house when their home was struck, leaving 2 of his family members dead and 4 injured. This was not the first time the Kenyan military has bombed Somalia. The Kenya Defense Forces invaded southern Somalia almost exactly 10 years ago in October of 2011 and never left. In addition to ground troops, air power has been an integral element of the Kenyan military's ongoing operations against the militant group Al-Shabaab. Somalia has been the target of imperial warfare for almost 15 years now. It was under the Bush administration in the early 2000s that U.S. officials speculated about al-Qaeda operatives with ties to the country. But after their embarrassing retreat from Mogadishu in 1993, the U.S. military had no intention of placing U.S. troops on the ground. Instead, it invoked the language of partnership and sought to garner support from allies on the continent who would be ready to deploy their own troops to the front lines. Ethiopia was the first to step up as a quote-unquote partner, and with U.S. support, the Ethiopian military invaded Somalia in December of 2006, dislodging the first stable government Somalia had had in years. Soon after that, the Obama administration authorized U.S. drone strikes as well as the deployment of special operations forces inside the country. When Donald Trump came into power in 2017, he expanded the discretionary authority of the military to conduct airstrikes in the country. This resulted in an unprecedented escalation of U.S. drone strikes in Somalia, with approximately 900 to 1,000 people killed, and this is a conservative estimate, between 2016 and 2019, and tens of thousands of people displaced. Soon after President Biden took office in January of 2021, he imposed temporary limits on the Trump-era directives, thereby constraining drone strikes outside of quote-unquote conventional battlefield zones. In practice, this means that the U.S. military now requires White House permission to pursue terror suspects in places like Somalia and Yemen, where the U.S. is not officially at war. It's partly with this in mind that I opened with a story about a Kenyan airstrike rather than an American one. As the Biden administration seeks to restore the image of the U.S. abroad, it's possible that the U.S. will assume a backseat role in counter-terror operations in Somalia. Relying more heavily on its partners in the region would enable the U.S. to offset the public scrutiny and liability that comes with its own direct involvement. This means that we need to be attuned to the war-making practices of U.S.-trained partner forces. At this point, we have a growing understanding of the infrastructures that enable U.S. drone strikes, from logistics hubs to forward operating sites to cooperative security and contingency locations across the continent. For example, the U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM, operates from military bases in Kenya and Djibouti that serve as launch pads for drone strikes in both Somalia and Yemen. But anthropologist Madiha Tahir reminds us that post-9/11 drone warfare is only the most visible element of what she refers to as distributed empire, wherein a whole range of actors and infrastructures are mobilized to expand the reach of the war on terror. In other words, to focus exclusively on AFRICOM is to miss the wider matrix of violence that is at work. There are all kinds of actors across East Africa that sustain the U.S.'s war-making apparatus in the region. With this in mind, I approach the war on terror not as one single apparatus of rule, but as a conglomeration of interrelated geopolitical projects. Despite the fact that a number of African states have been engaged in their own targeted operations against Al-Shabaab, they are often dismissed as proxy or mercenary forces in an otherwise American-centered war. But when we dismiss these actors, we end up reifying rather than unsettling dominant modes of geographic thought, wherein we typically conceive of as the geography of Africa is disconnected from the wider world and from the production of power and space. Here, I'm indebted to scholars like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Catherine McKittrick, who push us to think about geographies of relationality without dismissing asymmetries of power and the brutalities of domination and marginalization. In the Western imagination, Africans themselves are either too parochial or too subjugated to constitute the geopolitical. What happens when we take subaltern geographies and peoples seriously as sites and subjects that co-constitute the geopolitical? What happens when we pay attention to Global South leaders who authorize the purchase of military hardware, to the political and business elite who normalize militarized masculinities, and to the contracted laborers like truck drivers, cooks, and troops deployed to the front lines? In the past 20 years, the African continent has seen the largest relative rise in military spending of any region in the world. Governments in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda, for example, have been increasingly invested in the business of war. In addition to the material aspects of warfare, these governments have put a lot of work into convincing their populations that sending their troops abroad to fight Al-Shabaab is not only legitimate, but necessary. One of the points I'm making here is that there are limits to what the US government alone can do to justify endless war. The second and related point is that there are many different sites to study and to resist. To demonstrate this, I'll speak briefly about the racialized labor that sustains war-making in Somalia, focusing specifically on the peacekeeping operation known as AMISOM. In 2007, after the Ethiopian military invaded Somalia, the United Nations authorized an African Union peacekeeping operation known as AMISOM to stabilize the country. It began as a small deployment of roughly 1,600 troops and gradually metastasized to a number that exceeded 22,000. Moving beyond essentialized imaginings of Somalia as one vast, quote-unquote, ungoverned space, we have an opportunity here to reflect on the microgeographies of transnational military supply chains like AMISOM. The deployment and distribution of African troops to different regions of Somalia points to the relationship between the who, the where, and the how of global warfare. Ugandan troops are deployed to one part of the country, the regions of Banadir and Lower Shabelle. Kenyan forces are responsible for another area, Lower and Middle Juba. Ethiopian troops have been in charge of yet another area, Bay and Bakul, as well as Gedo. Djiboutian forces are in charge of Sector 4, and Burundian forces are in charge of Sector 5, the Middle Shabelle region. Each of these actors, or sectors as they're referred to, represent a confluence of labor, land, and capital, requiring the active or tacit collaboration of a range of actors, including state and international bureaucrats, who work to codify and legitimize the movement of money, arms, and troops into specific places. If we take the time to study the built environment, we would find not only defensive architectures, but equally the offices, housing barracks, and leisure facilities that are needed for everyday operations. Then there are the African troops themselves, who for the most part remain imperceptible as social, political, and geographic subjects who are relevant to our understandings of global warfare. Studying the quotidian spatial practices of these troops, operating checkpoints, erecting roadblocks, we can reflect on the dynamic aspects of these spaces and the interactions of various actors within them. As AMISOM troops are increasingly tasked with counterinsurgency operations, relationships with the Somali population have deteriorated, leading to rising death tolls of civilians and soldiers alike. But these everyday dynamics rarely garner international attention. The rhetoric of quote-unquote peacekeeping ensures that outside observers continue to conceive of AMISOM as something other than what it is, a transnational apparatus of violent labor that exploits group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And this is how Ruth Wilson Gilmore defines racism. These grounded realities demand a more complex analysis of imperial war-making in the region, both to account for the limited power of U.S. drones and to grapple with the overlapping governing techniques and spatial practices that are at play. They bring into focus networks and relations of power and everyday dynamics, rather than locations that are simply subjugated or ungeographic. To be clear, this is not simply about highlighting subaltern agency. Instead, in the words of Catherine McKittrick and Clyde Woods, it is to recognize that Black histories, bodies, and experiences are often hidden from view, such that we fail to apprehend the ways in which they are implicated in the production of space. My goal here is to direct our attention to the ways in which African geographies are not external to, but constitutive of, the shape-shifting formations of post-9/11 global warfare. While visual tools like maps have helped render the American military base visible, this has had the effect of rendering other places and spaces invisible. Many of these maps reduce the African continent to a set of dots, wherein quote-unquote relevant Africa consists either of U.S. military bases or of the militant groups that the U.S. is combating. These imaginative geographies foreclose consideration of alternative mapping practices, some of which chart a terrain of struggle. In 2013, for example, hundreds of workers staged a protest at U.S. Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti in response to an announcement of mass layoffs. A few years later, Djiboutian employees at Japan's military base in the country protested the dismissal of 90 workers when the Japanese Defense Ministry changed its contract for food services. In short, an exclusive focus on the imperial war room is to maintain a unidimensional conceptualization of necro and geopolitics. Our challenge is to bring into focus other maps in order to grapple with the multiplicity of geographies that simultaneously make global warfare possible and that point to alternative imaginings and life worlds. Thanks.
We had a number of questions for you. And again, we urge the audience to post your questions in the chat, and we will take them along the way. So Summer, thank you so much again for that presentation. In the last iteration, in the last event, Nick Estes talked about empire, and he talked about the fact that within what we today call the United States, that this is not just a colonial settler state, but that it is also an imperial state. And he was drawing out the long history of that struggle among indigenous peoples within the territories that now comprise the United States. And today you seem to be giving us another model of empire. And this is one that, as you say, operates through the language of partnership, and that has specific ramifications for the geopolitics of visibility. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about this.
Thanks, Madiha, and a huge thank you to all of the organizers for convening us, especially to you, Madiha and Adrien, for all the work that you have done in bringing together an exceptional group of people for what I think will be an exciting series of conversations. So to try to answer your question about empire, I would say that my thinking has been informed by transnational feminists and others who emphasize histories and geographies of relationality, and who have insisted that the constitution of the quote unquote global has never been the exclusive preserve of white men and North Atlantic political actors. It's also informed by extensive ethnographic research in Kenya. As I mentioned in my talk, the Kenyan state has become, as a key ally of the US, has assumed an increasingly prominent role in the war against Al-Shabaab. And yet Kenya remains imperceptible as a political actor that is relevant to our understandings and our theorizations of imperial warfare. Among Euro-American policymakers, for example, African leaders and security personnel continue to be racialized as inferior or less capable when compared to their Euro-American counterparts. And on the other side of the political spectrum, anti-imperial activists often assume that African partner states are simply following the directives of and aspirations of empire, right? And I think here of the Tanzania's first president, Julius Nyerere, who in 1969 noted the tendency of Western analysts to squeeze African events into the framework of big power conflicts. He said, this implies that Africa has no ideas of its own and no interests of its own. And in my talk, what I was trying to convey is that the fact that several African governments have sent troops to occupy Somalia over the last 15 years, this is something we need to think about at a time when many analysts are using metaphors like light footprint to suggest that large-scale interventions and occupations are over. For me, I think to myself, whose footprints are we talking about here? Whose footprints matter, right? So the other thing that I'm trying to get at is this imagined geography of empire that has become dominant in critical thinking of the war on terror. And when I use the term imagined geography, I'm drawing obviously from the work of Edward Said and his, suggesting that we think about the ways in which the so-called Orient is constructed in particular ways. Now, in my case, I'm thinking about how we as critical thinkers construct a geography, an imagined geography of how empire works. And this imagined geography is one that first is animated by the idea of a deterritorialized war machine, seemingly unencumbered by history, by geography. It's one that relies on masculinist, abstract renderings of space and positions white men as the primary political actors. It fetishizes instantiations of US power, primarily in the form of the drone strike. And the effect is to obscure the lived realities, histories, and politics of the populations that have become entangled in its workings. And Madiha, as you so poignantly noted in your Boston Review article that came out a few weeks ago, the wounding of empire's targets don't make the kind of war story that Americans want to learn about. But at the same time, you note that it's not just about the victims of imperial warfare, right? The same is true of quote unquote partner states and the security organs that sustain US empire. And the details of who those actors are, how they operate, what motivates them, similarly don't seem to make a good war story. Again, as you note, the kind of actions that these actors are engaged in are actions that continue to shape the lives of people long after drones have gone. And yet somewhere in our analysis, we seem to lose sight of these actors. And here, I think it's worth revisiting an observation made by Anne Stoller, because she reminds us that sometimes the task is to identify how things get cut off from one another in our conceptualizations of US empire. So she says, what prevents certain people and relations and things from being seen as implicated and interconnected? And the reason all of this matters is that the US government could decide to bring an end to drone warfare in Somalia tomorrow. It could even shut down its military bases in the region. But in the meantime, African states have had 2 decades of US financial, military, and political support to effectively do what they want in the name of security, including invading other countries. So there's a wider matrix of violence that remains largely unscrutinized that I think we need to account for in our analysis.
Thank you so much for that. So one of the follow-up questions that I have, and I want to tack on an audience question here as well, is the question about, as you're saying, we need to kind of think about these actors more than as just simply proxies, right? And that this is the tendency to do that. And elsewhere, you've used the work of the Kenyan scholar Ngugi wa Thiong'o's notion of moving the center to reframe our understandings of the war on terror. So can you talk a little bit about what moving the center means and what are the political and ethical stakes of that? And alongside that, the question, the audience question is, what would you say to African visionaries that have proffered that to achieve economic well-being and African security and peace, African nations must forge a path to prosperity that is independent of Western prescription?
Great, so thank you for both of those questions. Starting with Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he published a book in 1993 called Moving the Center. And in that text, he offers us a framework through which to move away from lingering conceptualizations of the so-called local and instead to grapple with the plurality of world centers. So rather than conceive of the third world or the global south as marginal or derivative of world politics, he foregrounds the ways in which countries in Asia and Africa, for example, in the post-independence period of the 1970s, were asserting their right to define themselves and the relationship to the universe from their own centers across the global south. Now, for Ngugi, the point is not to replace one quote unquote center with another. He emphasizes the significance of plurality for our understandings of the geohistories that have made the world that it is today. So for me, I think this pluriversal lens resists the notion that East Africa is a fixed geography, and it pushes us to scrutinize the politics of area studies, wherein the world map is divided into distinct territories and regions that signify difference. To respond to the second question about African visionaries who are seeking to achieve economic well-being, I think in many ways, this is at the heart of what I'm trying to think through, in the sense that African political leaders are fully aware of the ways in which race shapes and constitutes the world order. And by that, I mean 2 things. One, there's an understanding of the ways in which Africa has long been racialized as a space of otherness. And you add to that now, in the last 20 years, with the emergence of the war on terror, new significations and new meanings that are attached to Africa as a space of otherness with the notion of Islam as a threat, right? And the fact that there is a large number of Muslims in the continent as well. So what are African leaders thinking and doing as they process this reality, right? My contention is that they are thinking strategically, and they're concluding that the way to make their mark in the world and to survive economically, have the potential to be earning salaries that are up to 8 times what they earn back home in their home countries when they're not deployed to the front lines. And African governments that are deploying these troops, of course, pocket a certain percentage of these salaries. And on a day-to-day basis, if you kind of take the time to ask different families, whether it's in Kenya, whether it's in Uganda, countries that have deployed troops to Somalia, they see this war as a good thing, right? Because these troops are sending money back home, much needed money back home. And so we have to think about the ways in which now Africans are being pitted against one another in order to survive.
Thank you so much, Summer. Daryl, you wanted to jump in, please feel free.
Yeah, thank you, Summer. That was a really great exposition of so many things. And, you know, I think the work that both you and Madiha are doing in terms of re-theorizing how the war on terror unfolds on the ground through the confluence of these different agendas and logics and actors is super important. And I was really curious about this one line from your presentation about state actors, especially like, say, the Kenyan military, as being kind of invisible. And I think, you know, as a comment on sort of discourses inside the United States, or just more broader kind of international circulating discourses about the war on terror, that absolutely makes sense. But I was curious about the politics of visibility or invisibility for audiences in places like Kenya, right? And you know, to what extent is Kenyan participation in, you know, war on terror logic something that is rendered hyper visible or invisible, and under what circumstances? And I imagine part of this might also depend on when state actors are exercising violence within their territory versus times when, like, for example, with Somalia, they're, you know, somewhere else. So yeah, I was just curious about kind of thinking about visibility and invisibility from, you know, from many different angles, sort of, you know, continuing in the spirit of your overall intervention.
Thanks for that question. I have a lot of thoughts. And I think I'll start with the observation that investigative journalists writing about the war on terror in Africa love to use the language of shadows. You know, the headline, "America's Shadow War in Africa," is just repeated over and over and over. And the implication is, to use James Ferguson's language, is that Africa is a place where so much is unknown, hard to make out, and unknowable. But as what you're getting at here, Daryl, is what you see and don't see depends on where you're looking from, right? So many of us who are critical of the war on terror in the United States, for example, tend to think of Somalia only through the lens of drone warfare. Mm-hmm. But if we were to then shift our attention to neighboring Kenya, I've already talked about the realities, trying to get at the kind of the details of what this looks like on the ground in Somalia. But in Kenya, a geography that Americans don't typically associate with war or counterinsurgency, US-trained Kenyan police are employing military tactics of tracking and targeting potential suspects on the street, in mosques, in homes. So this means we also have to think about the entanglement of policing with war, and the fact that the people most directly affected occupy spaces far removed from the official battlefield. And again, to come to this question of invisibility and from what perspective, these are what is happening on the streets of Kenya is painfully, you know, felt and known by Kenyans themselves, right? Now, there is a discrepancy and there is a gap between Kenyan understandings of their security operations at home and understandings of their operations in Somalia. And here, this is where the kind of cultural performances and productions of power that the Kenyan state has engaged in play a role, because if and when Kenyans hear about their military in Somalia, it is not to learn about the violence, about the destruction, and about the displacement of civilians. Instead, it is to learn about the Kenyan troops as heroes who in many cases are sacrificing their lives in the name of this global project of security.
Thank you so much. That was far too brief a time, but we will return to this presentation at the end after all three presentations have done. So please feel free to continue posting questions. We will return to them. For the moment now, I want to turn to the next presentation by Dr. John Musiala.
Hello, I am John Musiala from the University of Southern Maine. Thank you to Professors Adrien, Zakar and Madiha Tahir for giving me the opportunity to participate in this conference. In this video segment, I will briefly discuss certain key issues from my presentation titled Drones and Surveillance in a Global World. Point 1. The use of digital technologies is essential to establishing new forms of dominance through drones. 2. These forms have significant effects on individuality, privacy, democracy, and American foreign policy. 3. Popular culture registers how the use of drone technologies raises complex questions about the exercise of individual, governmental, and social power. Let's begin with point 1. How the use of drone technologies establishes new forms of dominance in the world. It is a commonplace today to say that the globalization of information technology is transforming the way we live. Almost every sphere of life is in some form or fashion impacted by the digital. Space and time have compressed dramatically as social media technologies enable the production and circulation of information in various modalities. Figures from Statista for January 2021 show 4.66 billion internet users and 4.2 billion social media users. Our World in Data shows that in 2019, Facebook had 2.4 billion users, while YouTube and WhatsApp each had 1 billion users. And the list can go on. Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn, search engines like Google, DuckDuckGo, Bing, and so on. All of these are used by hundreds and millions of people every day. Drones are the result of such technological innovations. Here I have two small drones. This one is Propel, a type of micro drone. It's a zippy little drone. It doesn't have a camera, but it can fly. And you can see how when you push the battery in, it starts to get ready to fly. You can put it in the palm of your hand like this, and you can control it with a control pad. This one is a Rise Tello drone. It's a little larger than the Propel drone. And this one can be controlled through an app on your smartphone. You can also it has a video. It has video capability and a camera, which means you can take still and moving images. You can also predetermine a flight path for the drone, including somersaults and moving up or down and sideways and coming back to where you are. And this is also under 4 or 5 ounces. You can get any of these drones, and there are lots of them, by going to any site like, for instance, Amazon. And you can get the DJ Phantom 4 series, the Quantum Nova, 3DR Solo, Inspire 1. And if you're interested in small drones, there are things like Sky Nano, Arius, and so on. A word of caution, though. If you want to fly a drone, don't just get it and go outside and start flying. Make sure you read up on the Federal Aviation Administration's policies and guidelines. Check your state guidelines and the local municipalities' guidelines and policies. Make sure you do that before you take your drone outside. Let's move to a different type of digital machine, the armed drone. 3 of them have become iconic symbols of drone warfare. The Global Hawk, the MQ-9 Reaper, and the Predator. These drones have become the sine qua non for maintaining a new global order. Having been introduced into service in the Iraq War in 2003 under President George Bush, armed drones gained dramatic traction during the Obama presidency, continued into the Trump presidency, and now extends into the Biden presidency. Thousands of people outside the US have been targeted and killed. The tragedy is that many innocent men, women, and children also died because of drone warfare. Thanks to the hard work of educators, of activists, journalists, and ordinary people living ordinary lives, thanks to their efforts, when they started raising these concerns in the public arena, eventually the American military publicly acknowledged the program, and the Congress conducted inquiries, issued reports, and made policy recommendations. But the issue is not settled. Drone warfare continues. May I urge you to bear in mind that it is possible that one of these days an armed drone may come to your town, your city, your state, your country. In fact, public safety officials in the United States, some units, have already applied for licenses to use drones for law enforcement. What makes armed drones formidable technologies is that they conjoin multiple platforms, hardware and software for remote, semi-autonomous ability to take off, hover, and land in various, especially hard-to-reach places, the ability to carry lasers, guns, and short and long-range missiles, and the cameras, lenses, and gyroscopes needed to surveil an area, a city, a town, or individuals by producing billions of bytes of information that can be endlessly visualized in loops, distributed, and digitally scanned and later analyzed. Well, there are certain benefits to drone warfare, like less reliance on troops on the ground, like a less need to set up a vast infrastructure to support the personnel on the ground. It cannot be gainsaid that drone warfare is fundamentally changing notions of war and peace. With drones, a nation can be officially not at war, but for years lob missiles into another country's territory, while justifying such acts in the name of peace. Drone wars take place anytime and anywhere. They redefine notions of normalcy and exception as they generate constant insecurity by waging perpetual war. In drone warfare, it is difficult to ascertain when a country is at war and when it is not, when conditions of peace prevail and when they don't, because the anytime, anywhere matrix enables powerful states to create and manage conditions of emergency on a scale that is trans-territorial and biopolitical. Thus, the drone instantiates a new structure of biopolitical power that seeks invasive domination through constant secret surveillance of a space, its peoples, its inhabitants. It is within the drone's optic field of operations that guilt is assumed and innocence a burden to be proven. The terror of the drone is not only that it takes life without notice and with blinding speed, or that it comes from nowhere and recedes into nowhere, or that it hums its presence and withdraws into thin air at a time of its choosing. No, it is much more than that. It adjudicates life on a daily basis of surveillance that considers everyone suspicious, leaving little room for innocence to become the norm and guilt an aberration. That is the terrifying nature of the drone. It is a predator on the prowl, not only for those intending to cause harm, but for those who, in some situations, cannot speak, cannot establish or convey their innocence. Let's move to the third point, culture. A corollary development is the overlapping of the political with the cultural in the use of drones. Artists like Mahawish Chishti, James Bridle, Adi Wagnecht, and sites like Not a Blugsplat and Murmuration, a festival of drone culture, and there are many such artists and initiatives. All of these demonstrate the extensive range of creative and critical work emanating from different parts of the world. They underscore the need for us to grasp the drone and by extension the digital in multiple registers as tools that unleash our desire for creativity and innovation, and as tools that unleash our desire for control and domination. When we are faced with such pressing matters, we need to return to key questions. What kind of society do we want? What kind of culture and civilization do we wish to bequeath to the next generation? What principles of justice, peace, and dignity do we need to affirm? What rights of speech and dissent should be protected? How can we revitalize public culture so that civic awareness translates into civic responsibility? What truths do we hold to be self-evident, and why? Why do these truths matter to us, or rather, ought to matter to us and to others? I leave you with these thoughts for your consideration. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, John. The floor is now open for questions. Please post your questions in the chat. John, in light of Samar's presentation earlier, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your understanding of empire. You're giving us here another model of empire in which weaponized drones has been central to US imperial and geopolitical reach. Can you talk a little more about how you see technology's relationship with imperial power?
Thank you, Adrien and Madiha. Thank you for the invitation and for holding this conference. It's great to be with Samar and Daryl, and we're looking forward to the excellent lineup of speakers over the next few weeks. Trying to thread a couple of ideas. When we're looking at this notion of empire, we may have to unpack a few terms that are a little common, but it helps to enumerate certain subtle differences. Colonialism, imperialism, and empire. So colonialism describes the act of one entity intervening in another country, taking control of its resources, establishing systems of extraction, and using certain institutions and setting up institutions also for extracting labor and managing that, and then commodifying all of that and putting them in an international market. Now that would be colonialism. You can have settler colonialism and non-settler colonialism. Then we have imperialism, which describes the kind of constant interference in the internal affairs of another entity, another nation state. And one way to think about the difference between imperialism and colonialism is to look at how a colonial entity inevitably is a imperial entity in terms of its ideology, in terms of its the way it justifies its work. But not all imperial entities end up being colonial entities. And that would be a useful way to think about it. Empire has that sense of scale and reach. So historically, we have the Mongol Empire, the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British, and now the American, the list goes on. In terms of empire, its meanings are as varied as they're contradictory. Chalmers Johnson looks at America as an empire because it has so many military bases, more than 800 around the world. Noam Chomsky chastises the United States for its consistent hypocritical stance on promoting human rights, but transgressing them at home. Antonio Negri and Michael Hart describe the movement from the modern to the postmodern world in which juridical processes, constitutional arrangements, networks and alliances structure the flow of power in the global world today. Neil Ferguson, he urges Americans to accept the fact that America is an empire and that they should be committed to enacting its vision. And if we're looking now at, I think I should also mention one interesting book, a very important book by Amy Kaplan and Donald Pease, who published the Cultures of United States Imperialism sometime in the early 90s, which marked an important turn in the discipline of American studies because it placed empire at the center of study. If we're looking at the modern contemporary configurations of empire, we are looking at two things in terms of technology, the issue that, Adrien, that you had raised.
Perhaps,
yes.
Oh, perhaps as you are, before you tell us about those two aspects, I'd like to maybe field the questions. In your presentation, you say that, a drone can be used anywhere, anytime. But then, in reality, the fact has been like its use has been largely restricted to neo-colonial or post-colonial spaces. There's an economy or a geography of violence that happens in terms of the drones being used in neo-colonial and post-colonial places, but also being operated on indigenous grounds within the United States. How do you untangle that geography and economy of violence? Great
point. And this goes directly to the kind of work that Samar and Daryl are doing. I'm struck by the phrase that Samar had used in a presentation about the limits of American empire. And one way to look at the limits of American empire is to see how at those limits, we notice the entanglement of different interests, often competing interests of different groups and different nation states. So if we're looking at drone technologies, we're also seeing a disturbing development, which is that drone technologies are now on the international market. So on the one hand, we have the United States aggressively launching or maintaining now, not just launching, a regime of drone surveillance. But the capitalist impulse is also simultaneously putting these technologies in the market. And many countries are working closely with the United States and other countries too, like Israel and the UK, And so we are looking at how, as Madiha Tahir described this, distributed network of empire, where it is becoming difficult in some instances to locate the locus of power, even as we feel the impact of the circulation of that power in global networks. And so we have instances now, I mentioned this in my talk too, several police departments in the United States have actually applied for licenses to use not just drones for public safety, which is important. And there is a wonderful feature about drones that we can certainly use in civic life, but they're using it and they're asking for armed drones. And so we're looking at a growing sensibility where all of life, in a way, it's not just life outside the boundaries of the country, but within the home, that is being subsumed carefully and generally and comprehensively under the logic of surveillance. And that is a major risk for democracy.
I mean, this brings to mind Malcolm X's famous phrase that, the US violence came home to roost. Maybe you can, can you tell us more about this process of bringing the violence back home and how the US surveillance fits within this distributed empire that you just mentioned?
In terms of, there is another dynamic that can probably give us an angle into the discussion, which is the rise of big tech, big technology. So one of the things that, one of the ways in which surveillance comes about is, on the one hand, in terms of the military exercise of establishing these regimes of surveillance, it has a distinct military orientation. In terms of civil society, we're looking at a growing nexus between big business and big technology, and sometimes even non-governmental and governmental agencies. So now we have communication technologies like Twitter and Facebook, constantly surveilling the discussions that are going on and exercising a measure of decision-making and control to suppress certain voices and to amplify other voices. And I'm bringing this up because there is an ecosystem that is growing, and it helps us to understand how this ecosystem is growing in order to better understand how the particular technology of drone warfare, for instance, can become normalized both within the home country and outside. So we have one risk is the use of drones could be justified on perfectly legitimate grounds, but the kind of surveillance that it inevitably generates and then makes it subject to a kind of datafication of ordinary citizens, of ordinary peoples, especially peoples who are moving in and out of the country, at the border. All of that now becomes subject to a different kind of logic, a logic where digital data generates digital doubles, digital dossiers, which have to fit certain kinds of profiles in order for power to be exercised. So I hope that describes at a certain level the kind of ecosystem that is coming into place within our domestic setting, which of course has enormous implications outside also.
Thank you very much, John. We're looking forward to going back to these conversations in the sort of more general Q&A, and we'll give other panelists an opportunity to ask you questions as well. For now, let's just move on to Daryl Lee's presentation. Yes, please join us in welcoming Daryl Lee.
الحمد لله الذي خلق الخلق لعبادته وأمرهم بالعدل وأذن للمظلوم أن يقتص من ظالمه بالمثل. أما بعد، فالسلام على من اتبع الهدى. المشاهدات والمشاهدون، في الوقت الذي تلا غزوتي منهاتن والبنتاغون كان العالم يترقب كلمات رجل واحد، من كان متهما بأنه العقل المدبر لهذه العمليات والمتصدر لقوائم المطلوبين في العالم. ذلك هو الشيخ أسامة بن لادن أبو عبد الله لا سوى، من آثر المغامرة بإطلاق خطبه بين حين وآخر على الاختباء. كانت تسجيلاته وفيديوهاته تنطلق من مكان اختفائه عبر سلسلة من موصلين لتصل إلى وسائل الإعلام، لا سيما قناة الجزيرة. كان أبو عبد الله في هذه الخطابات يقحم نفسه والقاعدة فاعلين في ساحة جيوسياسية متضاربة ومعقدة. وفي الواقع كان حديثه المباشر إلى الشعب الأمريكي يجبر أقوى دولة في العالم على التقاسم المرتبطة ذاتها مع فئة مشتتة من المجاهدين. ومحور هذا كله كانت شخصية أبي عبد الله بطبعه الهادئ ولباثه الوقور وعربيته الناصعة، وكانت تبدو من ورائه خلفية وقورة لإظهار هيبة رجل الدولة، غير أن المشهد بدا متواضعا لما غابت بهرجات الدولة كالأعلام والمنصة والحرس الخاص. لم تكن هذه الرسائل مجرد انفلات من أنظمة المراقبة الإمبريالية، إذ غيرت النظرة للسياسة وتمثلاتها بثلاثة طرق. الأولى، أن أبا عبد الله اختار أن يسمع العالم ويراه، وأن يفعل ذلك بطريقته الخاصة وقد كان ما أراد. فما إن تظهر رسالة له حتى تجوب العالم وتهزه، ويجبر القادة الغربيون على الرد عليها ولو برفض، ويشكك الخبراء المزيفون بصحة نسبتها وتعتبروها نخب المسلمين الدينية والسياسية لا تعبر عن الأمة. أثارت هذه الخطابات نقاشات وجدالات حول كل شيء تقريبا ناهيك عن محتواها السياسي المباشر. تحدث أبو عبد الله بلغة السياسة الواقع وخطاب ردع، داحضا الادعاء بأن غزوتي منهاتن والبنتاغون كانتا نتيجة بغض القاعدة للحرية. ففي واحد من أشهر تحكماته تساءل أبو عبد الله لماذا لم يهاجموا السويد مثلا إذا كانوا فعلا يكرهون الحرية، فيقول في تعليق لم يحظي بالانتشار: معلوم أن الذين يكرهون الحرية لا يملكون نفوسا أبية كالنفوس 19 رحمهم الله، وإنما قاتلناكم لأننا أحرار لا ننام على ضيم. ويعتبر أبو عبد الله الهجوم الفاجئ في 11 من سبتمبر أبلغ مثال على انتزاع شروط الظهور. في لحظة يختفي منفذو العملية، وفي اللحظة التي تليها يقدمون للعالم مشهد لن يسع. الطريقة الثانية، أوضح أبو عبد الله أنه لا يكتفي بالتحكم في الشروط ظهوره، بل يذكر متابعيه بأنه مترصد للعدو. وحلل أبو عبد الله دور الولايات المتحدة في إلحاق الموت والدمار بالعالم الإسلامي، بداية من دعمها لحروب الكيان الصهيوني العدوانية، وانتهاء بحصار وخنق الشعب العراقي. وشدد على أن المواطن الأمريكي لن ينعم بالأمن ما دامت حكومته تتدخل في شؤون المسلمين، وأشار إلى أنه كان يتابع قرارات الحكومة الأمريكية السابقة والحالية، وأنه يراقب قراراتها المستقبلية ليحسم أمر الضربة وموعدها. لم يكن أبو عبد الله يخاطب الولايات المتحدة وحدها، بل تعداها ليشمل الأمة الإسلامية وشعوب الدول المتحالفة مع الحكومة الأمريكية، فهو لا يتحدث إلى الحكومات بل إلى الشعوب مباشرة، كما كان يعرب عن تضامنه ويقدم تعزيه ويحرض الناس على التضحية، ويقدم مبررات للعنف ويهدد بالمزيد منه، ولكنه في الوقت نفسه كان يعرض هدنات ويضع شروط للتفاوض والسلام. لقد سعى إلى موضع نفسه رجلا ذا مصداقية تؤخذ تهديداته ووعوده على محمل الجد تماما كحكومات الدول. الطريقة الثالثة، كان أبو عبد الله يحث متابعيه لا سيما في الولايات المتحدة وأوروبا على السعي لتغيير سلوكيات حكوماتهم، لأن ذلك هو الطريق الوحيد لإنهاء الصراع بحسب رأيه. فهو يقول: أيها الشعب الأمريكي، حسبوا الذين تسببوا في قتلنا، والسعيد من وعد بغيره. تعكس هذه المطالبة منطق العقاب الجماعي الذي تبنته الولايات المتحدة نفسها عندما كانت تحث شعوب البلدان التي تهاجمها على الانتفاض وخلع حكامها، كما تعكس منطق السيادة الشعبوية، إذ يمكن أن تكون الأنظمة مستجيبة لرغبات شعوبها، بل وينبغي أن تكون كذلك. إلى هذا الحد خاض أبو عبد الله حرب استنزاف، ويتباهي بأنه في مقابل كل دولار تنفقه القاعدة تخسر الولايات المتحدة $1,000,000 في إنفاق عسكري بلا طائل. ويبكت الولايات المتحدة على الفساد الذي شاب حروبها على أفغانستان والعراق، بل والأدهى أنه كان يدرك أن القاعدة لا يمكنها ادعاء الفضل في جرها للولايات المتحدة لهذا المستنقع، فقد أشار إلى أن الحرب تصب في مصلحة النظام الرأسمالي العالمي، لا سيما الشركات الكبرى مثل هاليبرتون. فكل من القاعدة والولايات المتحدة تحصل على بعض من أهدافها في الحرب، ومن ثم قال أبو عبد الله للأمريكيين: وإن الخاسر في الحقيقة إنما هو أنت الشعب. لنا أن ننتقد أبا عبد الله في إعطائه الحق لنفسه في التصرف باعتباره حامي حمى المسلمين، بينما تحل الكوارث على المسلمين الذين لا نعقى لهم ولا جمل. كما يمكننا أن ننتقد تكتيكاته مثل قتل الأبرياء، لكن ظهوره تحول من مجرد أداة للهيمنة الإمبريالية الصليبية إلى أمور أخرى، فتارة هو طريقة لإعادة صياغة الخطاب السياسي، والثانية هو وسيلة لإعطاء سردية مفارقة للأطر المهيمنة، وأخرى هو آلية للمساءلة. بعد كل ذلك يذكركم أبو عبد الله بإطلالة البصير نافذ السلطة والمطلع على خفايا الأمور وخبايا الصدور أنه مولى المسلمين والكافرون لا مولى لهم، وحتى ختامه كان وعيدا. والسلام على من اتبع الهدى.
Thank you so much, Daryl, for this fascinating performance, which raises a lot of questions about the geopolitics of visibility, who appears and who can take power over the media environment at a given period. You are clearly using the epistle genre of Osama bin Laden and who it makes visible and perhaps what it conceals. Can you explain a little bit more of your thinking behind this performance?
Yeah, I've been joking with my friends that it's my first attempt at Asian American performance art. And what I mean by that is that the video it's part homage and part parody, and alludes to the notion that geopolitics has a certain regime of visuality that attends to it, right? So we think of like iconic footage of debates in the UN Security Council chamber, speeches by statesmen and things like this. And what was interesting about the bin Laden messages, and in a way, the video also is trafficking in and tapping into a sort of early 2000s anti-nostalgia. One thing that I've noticed in some of the social media discourse in the past few weeks has been this collective acknowledgement of how truly bizarre a lot of the sort of media discourse of that time was. Anyway, so, bin Laden, I think, was, attempting a certain kind of intervention and to set forth a different set of terms for conducting geopolitics. And I think that's an observation that has been made before. But one of the other ideas behind this video was to say that a vision of geopolitics is also necessarily a universalist vision, even if not always recognized as such. And the sort of universalist projects that speak in the idiom of the international community, normalize certain optics of cultural and racial diversity, right? So it's not, we don't think twice about the fact that people from all over the world have to give speeches at the United Nations in usually English or French, right? But the sort of, weirdness, that sort of intentionally cultivated weirdness of doing the speech in that style and speaking formal Arabic, I was trying to, in a way, like perform and put on the table that, that weirdness, right? The expectation that Islam is racialized in certain ways, right? So there's sort of this moment of like, what is this dude doing, right? Who's speaking in a certain way, appearing in a certain way that is unexpected, and kind of gesturing at the way that even projects like bin Laden's also had a particular idea of sort of universalism that was attached to them. But of course, in order to recognize that, it requires just sort of a much broader and more textured understanding of how universalism works in practice, which is why I wrote a book trying to explain, how to think about that. So anyway, that was the basic idea. And also, I just wanted to really compliment the organizers, Adrien and Madiha, for creating this opportunity, because I really wanted to think with you in terms of this collective project of what it means to have conferences or events in a very different space, right? And in a very different time. Like, we all know there is no such thing as going back to normal, whatever normal was. I think, what I wanted to do was to take advantage of the time horizon and of the medium of the pre-recorded video to do something that would be different from like the kind of conference paper that I might have, sort of imagined presenting otherwise. So thank you so much for this incitement to discourse, as it were.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you for allowing us to be the first space for your first performance. Hopefully we'll see more. So I had a question. One of the other things we were sort of wondering about were the politics of translation and virality and visibility. In terms of translation, you mentioned the eloquence of bin Laden's Arabic, but for non-Arabic speakers, right, that somehow gets lost in translation, because a lot of the ways in which he was translated and others of his ilk were translated were as this kind of over the top flowery language, right, which played into stereotypes of, of the floweriness and the opacity of this group of folks. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the way in which he's attempting this universalist project, but there is this chain of translation and mediation that happens. So that's one kind of question. And then linked to that, as you mentioned, there was this moment where there was this possibility of virality and visibility, and maybe there still is through cassette tapes. We can also think of the execution videos, for instance, that were circulated. But also we have things like the Tariq Mahana case, which I'm sure you know quite well, being a lawyer, in which Tariq Mahana, for folks that don't know, was a pharmacist in Massachusetts who translated videos, certain Islamist guerrilla videos, and posted them online with the translations. And as a result, he was charged and convicted of conspiracy. So I'm wondering what kinds of limitations there are and sort of how we think about the attempts at these universalist projects within this context. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So for Arabic speakers, there are some Easter eggs in the video, in the sense that there are moments where the transcript intentionally doesn't align with the Arabic text that well, in ways that also reflect the way that this speech is often mistranslated, right? So for example, in the subtitles, I think the word Israel is used when the Arabic was actually Al-Kayan As-Sahiyoni, the Zionist entity. I think there are some references to Crusaders also that maybe didn't make it into the English. And I was also part of the effect that I was kind of thinking about or trying to conjure. And you're absolutely right. The politics of translation are very much material ones. It's easy for people to forget about this, but at the time, the mere fact that Al Jazeera carried the Bin Laden videos made them a target. They were widely reviled in the United States and in other parts of the world for transmitting these videos. And their offices were bombed by the United States military, I believe, in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And of course, they said things like, oh, it was an accident, or we received intelligence that there was something there. But, I think the general consensus in the American elite was sort of like, good, they deserved it. So this was very hot speech, as it were, back in that moment and in that time. And you're absolutely right to reference the Tariq Mahanna case in connection with this. Actually, he and I grew up in basically neighboring suburbs of Boston. And, so again, just thinking about the ways that certain acts of translation and acts that are, ostensibly protected by American free speech constitutional law in this context became cast in a totally different way, and essentially were treated as they were criminalized as acts of material support for terrorism. And yeah, so anyway, all about sort of the radioactive properties of this discourse.
Thank you, Daryl. We have, in a sense, 1/2 more related questions. One of them is about placing this video and this kind of performance in a historical context of staging the colonial enemy. And perhaps we see sort of pictures of also guerrillas sort of resistance to colonialism staging themselves, and how can we situate that within the world of cassettes and after the early 2000s YouTube, and then how does that speak to a sense of militarized masculinity, and how does your performance speak to this, particularly in a sense your intention behind speaking about this topic that way? Isn't creating universalisms also about creating militarized masculinities? And how do you engage this in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, universalisms have a deeply ambivalent relationship with violence, right? I mean, basically, with universalist projects, there's often the sense that their appeal should be so self-evident that they don't require violence to be spread. But on the other hand, their importance is so self-evident that they have to be defended by force when it's deemed to be necessary, right? So you'll always have these two aspects of abjuring violence in one register, but then justifying it in another register. And I think when it comes to organized violence, masculinity and masculinization is, usually not far behind. And your question about the other video genre of kind of like the martyr last will and testament sort of video, these became widely circulated, especially during the second Intifada, right? There was this notion of the suicide bomber makes a video for it. So those are interesting because I think those are aimed at a very different audience than the Bin Laden videos, right? So those are usually aimed at a public that is seen as a constituency or potential constituency of those movements, and are often opportunities for the individuals involved to speak to kin and to friends and colleagues and neighbors as well. The Bin Laden videos, I think, are aimed at various Muslim audiences, but they are also, at least if you take them seriously on their own terms, also trying to speak to a really different audience, right? So in that sense, I think there's a bit of an interesting divergence. But the masculinity point is also really interesting. Bin Laden's, a lot of the praise and evaluation of Bin Laden by others in the movement stress a sort of adherence to prophetic notions of character and morals, or akhlaq, that are very much connected to notions of masculinity, but they often emphasize virtues of like gentleness and humility and other characteristics that are often described as almost feminine, right? And this is actually something, I mean, I've written about it a little bit in the book, and it's been written about by others elsewhere, because there's a subcurrent of security state expert discourse that reads these behaviors as essentially signs of like repressed homoeroticism, right? Like we expect them to be fanatics who are engaged in forms of toxic masculinity that we recognize, but then we see that men are holding hands and petting each other, and therefore there must be some sort of like homoeroticism going on there. And what that reading misses, of course, is that there are many, many different ideas of masculinity that can be mobilized and drawn upon in the universe of jihad movements and jihad practices. And often the one that Bin Laden is kind of appealing to or trying to emulate is the one of gentleness, right? It's not just that he's eloquent, he's also very soft-spoken, right? And the videos are not, they're not, their affect is not a blustery one, right? Even if the rhetoric might be in some cases.
Thank you so much. I want to remind the audiences to please go ahead and post questions that you might have for all three of the panelists in the Q&A sections. We're going to sort of now return to some of the questions that we've passed before and sort of open up a little bit. I want to stay a bit with this question of militarized masculinities and bring in Summer. Summer, you sort of mentioned this in passing, and Daryl is speaking at one level around the mediatic production of the universal, and you are sort of in your ethnographic work kind of thinking about the kind of everyday material kind of effects and crafting of this masculinity, and you mentioned it in passing. Could you speak a little bit more about how you see militarized masculinities in your work?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I think, it's really interesting to think about what it means to make oneself legible on the world map through war and militarized masculinity. And this is one of the points that I see Daryl getting at in his talk, in the form of the figure of Bin Laden. And I'm struck by the fact that, if we move beyond the competition between these ultra powerful figures like Bin Laden on the one hand and Bush on the other, right? And think more broadly about geopolitical contestations over masculinity in general, and the relationship between that and never-ending war. We might say that Bin Laden became perceptible as a political actor precisely for this reason, right? That he's promulgating violence and war, and this masculine desire to be visible that triggers endless war, right? And gets a lot of people killed is something that we need to scrutinize. And in the context of East Africa, the ways in which it plays out demonstrate the need for more attention to regional geopolitics alongside the broader dynamics that are unfolding. So in Kenya, a month before the Kenyan military invaded Somalia, the Ugandan president chided the Kenyan military and said that they're not a real army that fights real wars. Mm-hmm. And historically, Kenya has sent troops to peacekeeping operations, but it has never deployed troops for active combat abroad. Now, within a matter of 3 to 4 weeks, boom, they invaded. And there was a lot of talk internally amongst Kenyans about, whether are we manly enough, right, to go to war? There was a lot of gendered anxieties that shaped discussions and calculations. And a number of Kenyan scholars have really put at the forefront the importance of having a gendered analysis of power. You know, historically, Kenya's relationship to violent masculinity has been central to the authority of political leaders. And I think that this, you know, we're seeing now the ways in which this gets played out in the broader realm with the onset of the war on terror. And again, you know, it's hard not to lose sight of the end result, right? The number of lives that are lost as a result of these competitions, gendered anxieties and competitions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we could almost say that this is the sort of economy of violence as toxic masculinity in some sense, where it seems to me part of what's happening and what you're saying, Summer, is that, and I think this is coming through in Daryl in your presentation as well, is that they're co-constituting each other, right? I mean, Bin Laden and the United States imperial kind of imperial discourse is kind of, they're co-constituting each other and kind of giving each other a certain degree of status and power. That's part of, I mean, insofar as he's attempting to produce a counter-universal kind of narrative, but it's also, its power is partly connected to the fact that it's connected to empire in this way. Yeah.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think this is really interesting, this idea of, you know, competition and contestation, and just to kind of like, you know, continue or extend the framework that you guys are laying out. The contrast between Bin Laden on the one hand and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, and then the contrast between Bush and Obama is also kind of interesting, right? So Baghdadi does the opposite of Bin Laden, right? He almost never makes himself visible, recedes into near invisibility, sometimes issues audio statements. And part of that is maybe a security thing, but part of it also, I think, is a very conscious strategy to have a different politics of visuality, right? So for ISIS, of course, we know about the notorious videos of the executions and so on, which is very much about the kind of like downward distribution of the violent authority and a different kind of masculinity, right? And one that, you know, is much more of the recognizably toxic character. And in a somewhat similar way, I don't want to push the comparison too far, you know, Obama's embrace of war in that area is also, you know, he's very explicit about not assuming the mantle of the war presidency, right? And of course, he's still waging war, but it's that strategy of, you know, deferring to, or not deferring to, but of hiding behind, you know, other actors, right? Whether it's in the Syrian case, we can think of, you know, the YPG or the other Syrian factions who were backed by the United States, and that sort of like, you know, desire to recede, and it's a redistribution of authority and also a reorganization, reconfiguration of masculinized violence at the same time.
So we have some several audience questions actually about what's happened in Afghanistan. You know, the so-called withdrawal, the drone attack that ended up killing 10 members of a family, many of them children. And I'm wondering if you could sort of comment in light of your presentations about what you see, how you understand the Afghanistan situation, how you understand the drawdown, and kind of what you see going forward. John, perhaps you want to start, since there was this drone strike that everyone's been talking about.
Yes, it's interesting that one of the last military acts in Afghanistan was a drone strike. And I think it happened on August 29th or so, a few days following a suicide blast that had killed 13 US personnel and 170 Afghanis. And it turned out after a few days that Zamari, I think is his last name, he was working for a US nonprofit, education, nutrition and education, or some such entity, and that he had been closely aligned with the US troops there and working actively supporting them. And 10 people, it turns out, had died, many of them his family members, including 2 or 3 children. And what is remarkable, and I think this gets to a question that is in a chat box about how do we know What are the estimates of the people killed? What happened over the last few weeks is a good indication of what has been happening over the last 2 decades, which is that because of the efforts of people on the ground, people not in the traditional roles of authority and power, but largely in terms of social media and other channels raising these questions, eventually this information came out. And last week, the Pentagon officials admitted to the error. And if we go back, I think we have a question here. How do we know about these estimates? A lot of this information came out because of activists and journalists on the ground going to those places and writing up some kind of reports and asking for information. And if we look at what happened almost eight years ago, it was John Brennan, I think, who was the CIA director, eventually gave in to a lot of public pressure, and the Obama administration also finally acknowledged that there was indeed a formal drone program of the US military. So you have entities like the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. You have the Columbia Law School that issued a report in 2008 or so, or later. The Stanford Law Clinic was engaged in this. And notice that all of these are not the official arms of any government. And so a lot of these estimates that are coming into play are information that we have and that we need to assess. And sometimes the range can vary. Someone is saying it's 70,000, and we don't quite know how many civilians of the 70,000 are, and things like that. But this is very much a project in the making for civic culture and for public, for kind of civic responsibility too.
Summer, Sarah, thoughts?
I would rather pivot to you, Madiha. I think the audience should hear your thoughts on this question.
My thoughts on this question are that my sense of it is that, you know, as we're talking about drone attacks, that this is really a redistribution of power in the way that, you know, American hegemony and power in that area will operate, and not really a drawdown. In the sense that with this drone attack was, you know, apparently happened with the collaboration of the Taliban. So we see a reshuffling of alliances happening here. And again, this kind of production of consent and sovereignty, which you've talked about, Daryl, quite a bit. And this sort of farce that we now have an independent government that is simply, you know, consenting, which is what the US has long been doing in Pakistan. And I imagine that that will make, you know, we will always be able to track the drone attacks, but it'll make a lot of other things much harder and much more difficult to trace. But your thoughts, Daryl?
I mean, my main thought is, I just want to underscore the importance of the work that both you, Madiha, and Samad are doing, because, you know, I feel like the intervention sort of says, you know, on the one hand, the kind of conventional, you know, international relations idea that states are just actors pursuing their interests, like that's obviously very limiting. But then the other idea that, you know, all of these states are just totally, you know, the total puppets, totally at the mercy of the imperial powers, and don't have their independent agendas and interests and whatever, is also deeply limiting. So we have to come up with some other theorization of geopolitics that's somewhere in between. And I think the situation now in Afghanistan really pushes that, because with the Taliban now in power and also cooperating with the United States, albeit in very specific and careful ways, I think it just takes, with Kenya and with Pakistan, there's at least very deep and longstanding relations of dependency and aid that allow us to say, okay, there's something like a neo-colonial relationship, but also a lot of autonomy that needs to be accounted for. For the Taliban, I think it's even further in the direction of, you know, thinking about the autonomy of the local actors, even as they're implicated in what the US is doing, right? I mean, there's a certain variance of the left that would basically say, well, the US invented the Taliban and now they're just controlling the Taliban, and that wants to really fall on that side of the analytical equation. But I think that's not really, that doesn't really cut it, right? So I think for the idea in the final days of the evacuation, the head of the CIA, William Burns, flew to Afghanistan and had a meeting with Mullah Baradar, I think, one of the senior Taliban leaders. So, there's two very different ways of reading this, right? Some people are like, oh, this just shows that the Taliban is stepping in to be the new local puppet, and now we can just blame everything the Taliban does on the US. The other interpretation is, wow, look at how important the Taliban is. Now we're like this actor in international affairs that gets to have meetings with senior US officials. This shows how important and how autonomous we are, right? So I think, this is a really interesting moment and a really interesting shift. Like, how do we actually theorize their deeply, deeply ambivalent and violent, but not nihilistically antagonistic relationship between the US and the Taliban in this moment?
Thank you, Daryl. In your book, you talk about taking non-statist radicalism seriously. Could you comment as a close on what kind of radicalisms we should be taking seriously moving forward? Perhaps also Samar and John, you can jump in on the question of universality as white masculinity and the question of visibility and race. I know, Samar, you use frameworks from Black studies in your presentation and work. And so what do these analytical imports to the study of US empire in Africa can bring to us? So maybe as a sort of closing question for you all. Thank you. Perhaps, Daryl, you want to start?
No,
radicalism, non-statist, or Samar, perhaps?
Daryl, go ahead, since the first part was about your book, and then
I don't have a great answer. I mean, I think there's obviously a lot of renegotiations with the existing power structure that have been going on, right? So whether it's extra state forms of white supremacy and their relationship with mainline forms of white supremacy, that's obviously something that people have been thinking a lot about. And also, what I was trying to do with the book is to say, essentially, to left movements, we think a lot about non-state transnational stuff and violence, but it would make sense to study and learn from the examples of transnational jihad formations, because with all of the many things one can say about them, in the past 20 or 30 years, they have been, experimenting with and doing a lot of this work, right? And anyway, so that's just the basic takeaway message. In terms of what specific movements one should be paying attention to, I think, and again, this kind of gets back to what Samar and I were talking about earlier. It's a situational question, right? What movements matter, what movements you should be paying attention to, depend very much on where you sit. So anyway, I'm sorry, that's a bit of a cop-out, but I'm sticking with it.
Thank you.
John, go ahead.
But two responses, one brief, one a little longer. We probably in the university should invest more in departments of modern languages. And we know that some of the first departments that tend to disappear or get consolidated when there are financial exigencies, sometimes supposed exigencies, are humanities departments. And across the country, we have seen the elimination of departments of languages. So it was wonderful to have Daryl do the work he did, because it takes us right into the multilingual realities of globalization. And also in terms of, Adrien, your response, your question about the futures, so to speak, and language and polyglot ability is going to be probably more important than ever before. The other point is about empire, and this goes back to, Adrien, the question you had asked me earlier when we started off about empire. This is working at a slightly more abstract level in the sense for a certain reason, thinking of in 1780, Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding architects of the American Revolution and the Constitution, he writes a letter to General George Rogers Clark, whom he commissions to go to the Midwest because the British and the French and the Indians are trying to limit the expansion of the newly formed nation state. And in it, he talks about other things. He gives information and suggestions, but then he goes on to add. You can just briefly read this. This is Jefferson talking to General George Rogers Clark, and he says, "Add to the empire of liberty an extensive and fertile country, thereby converting dangerous enemies into valuable friends." In other words, the imperial project would end up converting dangerous enemies into valuable friends. There's this phrase of empire of liberty. A few decades later, in 1809, Jefferson is having a conversation with James Madison, and he uses the phrase empire for liberty in talking about Napoleon Bonaparte's transatlantic maneuverings and also the implications of the 1803 Louisiana Purchase. And then he goes on to say, he says, "I'm persuaded no constitution was ever before so well calculated as ours for extensive empire and self-government." And it seems like there are two postulates that are important here. One, the notion that every human being on the face of the earth is thirsting for freedom and liberty, which at first glance sounds like a platitude, because it is at first glance, but there is more going on, because we move to the next postulate, which is, if adequate conditions are provided, then there would be a natural outgrowth towards representative democracy and individualism, and the individual as the ultimate locus of liberal values. Mm-hmm. And we notice the modulations of these premises across the history of the United States. Mm-hmm. So to counter that, to engage it at that level, Adrien, would be probably one way to see how and why it has such enormous staying power. Mm-hmm. And then to engage with what Daryl and Samara are also talking about, the limits of American empire, where we see other interests and other competing groups also both benefiting from these structures and these regimes, while also combating with other groups, mm-hmm. seeking an alternative way of doing things and constructing society and political organization.
Thank you, John, for this long view. It's certainly you giving us a lot to think about. Perhaps, Samara, do you want to close our seminar today?
Sure, and I'll be brief. You mentioned my interest in Black studies when it comes to thinking through these questions, and specifically the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Catherine McKittrick, I have found to be incredibly generative in helping us to think through the need to recognize that geographies of violence, in this case, violence unleashed by the war on terror, are not exceptional. They're everyday spaces in which everyday people are trying to survive. I want to acknowledge that 10 years ago, almost exactly 10 years ago, was the anniversary of the Kenyan military's invasion of Somalia. And at that time, a group of Kenyan writers and intellectuals issued a statement protesting their government's decision to go into war. So I think that, this is an opportunity, I hope, to recenter their voices in conversation with voices all over the world in resisting the continuation of war.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists for a wonderful conversation. We'd also like to thank several faculty members, including Manan Ahmed, Marwa Elshakry, and Brinkley Messick, who have co-organized this series with us. This event is the second of 7 events. Technologies of Power has been made possible with the support of the Dean of Humanities at Columbia University, as well as the Center for the Study of Muslim Societies, the Departments of History and Anthropology, and the Middle East Institute. and of course, through the support of our current home institutions, ASU and the University of Toronto. Thank you everyone for joining us, and join us again in another 2 weeks for our next event. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.